welcome to tonight's special briefing about a recent fly-in to Poland and Ukraine border with the Jewish Federation of Greater New Haven. I am your host for this evening, Judy Alperin, the CEO of the Jewish Federation. And with me tonight, we have our Federation President, Dr. Stephen Fleischman, and our Chief Development Officer, Amy Holtz, to share their insights about their recent adventure to Poland and Ukraine. As we begin, though, it's not lost upon me the timing of their trip, what's happening in the world, and our own Jewish calendar. And as we're about to mark the holiday of Passover and our own exodus out of Egypt, and hopefully as we wander to the desert to the Promised Land, and we look at these millions of refugees fleeing Putin's war of aggression in Ukraine, and their exodus out of that country, I think that we are all especially attuned to this moment. And as we look back, we don't have to look back as far as thousands of years ago with the Passover story, but we can also just look back decades ago with our own experience during the Shoah, and how we found ourselves at that moment in time. And now it's Poland who is throwing their arms wide open in a warm embrace to welcome in the people who need them so desperately. And I think tonight what we're going to hear from Amy and Steve, I hope will illustrate for all of us why it's so critically important that we have a strong, secure, and vitally connected Jewish community that is represented by the Jewish Federations of North American system. So with that, I'm going to begin by asking Steve and Amy each to introduce themselves, beginning with Steve, and answering this very first question, which is, what Steve, compelled you to want to make this journey?
Thanks, Judy, and welcome everyone, and thank you for taking time to listen to us and let us share our experiences with you. So I think first, I'm Steve Fleischman. I'm the president of the Jewish Federation of Greater New Haven. I'm also an obstetrician gynecologist at Yale New Haven Hospital with Sound Obstetrics and Gynecology. And I've been in practice in the New Haven area for about 22 years now, and moved here now going on about 26 years ago to do my training and stayed on. For me, I think I'll start with the fact that I had the opportunity in 2018, I believe, to actually go on a mission through Federation to Ukraine and Israel. And it was the first time I'd done a Federation mission. And I think for me, donating money to Federation had always been, I understand what we do locally, but I didn't really understand what the impact was internationally. I didn't really understand sort of what the concept of federated giving was about. And so when I went there, I saw the amazing work that our overseas partners and agencies that receive funding from Federations of North America do on the ground in Ukraine. And we spent time in Kyiv. We met with people who were essentially homebound, many of them elderly Holocaust survivors, people who unfortunately, because some of the old Soviet era buildings don't have elevators, their only point of contact was people from the local Jewish federations, the local JCC, the JDC, and Jaffe. And it really made me proud to be giving to these organizations. When we spent time in Kyiv, we met with young people in youth groups who really only found out that they were Jewish within the last couple of years, and amazed to see how quickly a large organization of youth groups around Ukraine and other former Soviet Union countries developed. And for me, when the bombs started falling on Kyiv, I first thing looked back at the pictures from downtown Kyiv and really just couldn't imagine what the people that we had met, people we had talked to were experiencing. The idea that almost immediately hundreds of thousands of people were fleeing, trying to get out. And again, as for me as an OBGYN, watching the pictures of the maternity hospital being bombed and seeing pregnant women and babies killed, It just didn't feel enough to send a check for Ukrainian relief. There was something about me just really wanting to have an opportunity to bring over supplies, to bring firsthand things that were needed, and have an opportunity to show people there that we're here, and that even though we're halfway around the world, we're with them, we're supporting them. And I thought it was really important for New Haven to have a presence on these missions that are bringing people from communities all over the United States to show support for the refugees and the people fleeing Ukraine.
Thanks, Steve. Amy, tell us about you, why you went.
Hi, everybody. I'm Amy Holtz. As Judy said, I'm the Chief Development Officer for the Jewish Federation. I'm in Connecticut 7 years, and at the Federation coming up on 6 years, doing work that I passionately and wholeheartedly believe in. I think when the opportunity to accompany Steve on this trip was presented to me, I viewed it as a need to go and bear witness, a need to see and touch and feel what everyone there is going through. I unfortunately have not been to Ukraine before, so I only know the stories that others have shared with me of their visits. And to see what I was seeing and hearing on the news, I was very much compelled to be there firsthand, to be on the ground, to represent our community by bringing over 350 pounds of over-the-counter medical supplies and Passover activities for children to do at the Seders that will happen this weekend. I wanted to see what a difference one person can make, and one person working with another person. And I also felt it was really important to witness firsthand what our partners on the ground were doing. As Steve said, Federation is comprised of so many organizations, and we read about it, we hear what they're doing, we tell other people what we're doing, but I'm now back to say I saw it firsthand, and it is amazing how planful the organizations were in advance to be ready to help those on the ground at this terrible, terrible time. So I actually consider it an honor to have gone there and represent our community.
Thank you, Amy. And we were honored to have you both represent us. So I want to ask you both, beginning with Steve, to talk a little bit about the border first, and to describe what your experience was like there. But before you do, I just wanted to I know sometimes we have a little bit of inside baseball when we talk about our overseas partners, and we refer to the JDC, or sometimes called the Joint, which is the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee. And they're really our overseas partner that's charged with rescue and really caring for people all over the world, mostly Jewish, but also they have a non-sectarian arm as well. And the Jewish Agency for Israel, which we often call JAFE, which is focused a lot on Aliyah and resettlement in Israel. But as Steve was remembering the trip we took of just a few years ago, both of those partners were on the ground. JDC operating chesed centers, which are places that give nourishment and care, and operating JCCs. And JAFE, the Jewish Agency, was also there, not just for the purposes of bringing people to Israel who may want to make Aliyah, but for bringing them Jewish education and for them discovering their Jewish roots and running Jewish summer camps, which we got to visit. So this rebirth of Jewish life that was happening in Ukraine was astonishing. And now all of those people are forced to flee. So Steve, could you tell us about the border and what that experience was like?
Yeah. So we woke up very early on our first morning there. The bus left at about 5:15 in the morning, and we went on about a 5.5 hour ride down to Medica, which is one of the 8 border crossings from Ukraine into Poland. And in the picture you see, that is Amy and I, and we were essentially on the inside of the gate, which is the fence that sort of the final entry into Poland. And it's really, for me, it was an overwhelming emotional experience for multiple reasons. First and foremost, every country in the world had some tent set up. And you can see in the pictures, it doesn't do justice to how long the line of that road is that leads from the fence when you first cross into Poland to the parking lot, which is probably 150, 200 meters. And everywhere along that, right up against one another, are tents from countries, from France, from Germany, from India, all over the world, set up tents and provided services for refugees who are just walking through. So from the very beginning, they can get a bag, they can get food. There were people walking around with pizza. There were people walking around with coffee. There were people walking around with stuffed animals for kids, toys for kids, and everyone was just providing services. And to see such an amazing humanitarian outpouring of support from everywhere around the world just kind of gave you a little faith in humanity again. I would say if you look right behind us, the first thing you see is the Jewish, is the Israeli flag. And I think for me, it was another moment that was extremely filled with pride to know that the first tent set up when you cross into Poland was set up by Israel, the JDC, and Jaffe. And so there's actually 3 tents. The first one is just a welcome with some supplies you can pick up. There's a medical tent right next to it. So just to the right of where we're standing there was a medical tent that is staffed by physicians every day of the week. So the first thing, anyone who crosses over who's not feeling well, they invite them into the tent. They'll run through medications. I mean, I think if you realize when you go on vacation, you take a week's worth of medications with you, even if you're going away for 2 days. If you know you're going for a week, people will stock up and they'll bring maybe 2 or 3 weeks in case something happens. Most of these people who crossed over had no opportunity to prepare for any travel. They grabbed a bag and they left. And so the physician who we spoke to in the tent said the most common thing was patients who really hadn't taken a blood pressure medication in weeks. And many of them had blood pressures well in excess of anything we would normally hospitalize here, and providing them with medications, with several weeks supply of medications, all donated by people. And that is staffed by the JDC. The physician we actually saw that day was someone who came from University of Rochester, which was wonderful to see. And then right next to that tent was another tent set up by JDC and the agency, which basically was for women and children only. So I wasn't even allowed to go in to look at it. And it was a safe place for women and children to go, to take a break, for kids to play a little bit, and for people to rest, clean up, and change their clothes and get some supplies. And it really was just amazing first to see that JDC and the Jewish Agency were the sort of first boots on the ground at the border providing these services. And also, more importantly, the fact that, really all over the world, people were there to support refugees crossing the border there. So we spent, I'm sure Amy has a few things to say, but it really, there's some pictures there of, the buses that bring people away from the area. That little lineup of strollers is just what's on the outside. The tent behind it is stocked with more strollers, wheelchairs, anything that's needed for families who are coming by who, didn't have the necessary equipment that they needed when they crossed the border.
Amy, I think picking up on the strollers is right where you want to be.
Quite, Steve, that was one of the hardest parts for me on the border, and you may or may not know that. If I had to sum up what it was like to be on the border, the first word that comes to my mind is emotional. And for anybody who saw my video from the border, that it was very hard for me to keep it together, talking from this particular spot where Steve and I are standing. We're facing in that photo the Ukrainian side of the country, and we're watching people come down a pathway, and you could see that path by the strollers on foot, pushing wheelchairs, pushing strollers, carrying bags, carrying children, emotional. exhausted, overwhelmed, and it's like they can see the finish line and they just want to get there. And then you turn around and you go through the fence back to the Poland side of the border, and you see this incredible outpouring of support from all over the world, as Steve said. Every country, every language, all ages. There were teenagers through, 70, 75-year-old people there to greet you, there to direct you, and there to just welcome you with a smile, a hug, or a handshake. Watching what happened as people crossed over and dispersed to the various tents, made their way to the buses to go to the local, it's not a great word, it's like a clearing spot, like where you can talk to somebody about where you ultimately want to go if you're there temporarily, or you're just coming across the border for some respite and supplies and you plan to go back. And they have this whole incredible organizational plan of how to track you and know where you are. They're handing out SIM cards for your phones so that you can use your phones, and portable chargers so that you don't run out of battery. It's just overwhelming and emotional. And it, in the face of this horrible crisis, it is almost like a feel good, like, look at humanity coming together and look what we can do when we all put aside whatever differences we might have. The strollers, as Judy referenced, was particularly tough for me because I encountered a woman right before I walked back into Poland who picked her children up, two twins, out of their stroller, and said, and told the person she was walking with, who translated it for me, that I want to walk across. I want my children to walk across to freedom. And it was just, that was it. I was done. I was toast. So the strollers are something that will always remind me of where I was and what I witnessed.
So you spoke about the Israeli presence in the area, and I'm curious to know about meetings that you may have had with any Israeli officials or local Jewish community leadership, and what they may have shared.
You can go first, Steve.
Yes, sure. So everywhere we went, we met with, people from JDC, the Jaffe. Everywhere we went, there were people who greeted us, kind of went over what they were doing, why they were doing it. The first night we got there, we did have dinner with the chief rabbi for Poland, as well as the Israeli ambassador to Poland, who both shared with us sort of what they're working on. And I think, again, it just goes to the just immense size of this crisis. 2.6 million Ukrainians passed into Poland. And it's just that the sheer volume of the number, I don't think really, it's hard to really understand and fathom how big of a lift that is. The one place we went to housed 1,500 people. And I think if they only house 1,500, how many of those centers need to exist around the country in order to move people through? But everyone we met, from Jaffe, from the JDC, they were all, when the call came, they jumped at the opportunity to come. Anyone who spoke Ukrainian, Russian, or Polish essentially got on a plane and came here. We met one young person who came over and is working for JDC, who came as a child when people left the former Soviet Union. She was Ukrainian and moved to LA, and essentially left her job in LA when this started, got on a plane, and is a volunteer at one of the hotels that has refugees housed there. Every volunteer we talked to had another story about how they ended up there. But it was really, I'm in such awe at their ability to be working the number of hours they're working as volunteers, helping people out, doing it with a smile, doing their best to sort of bring a smile to the face of people who really don't know where this is ending. I think that was a really hard thing for me to grasp, is that when we deal with emergencies here, oftentimes they're self-limited. We have a hurricane, we have a tornado, we have something that damages property, that displaces people, but we know that the thing that displaced them is over. And there's going to be time to rebuild, but there's an end. There's a timeline in people's mind about, I will get back to normal. I think for everyone we met here, that doesn't exist. They have no idea. We don't know when this is ending. We don't know what's left when they go home. For many of these people, they don't know if they have a house to go home to. They don't know if they have family to go home to. Communications are difficult. And I think that unknown and that feeling of helplessness, that there's nothing that they can do but wait, is really an incredible weight on them. And I think it's amazing that these volunteers that we met with all over the place are doing such an amazing job working with families and doing their best to support them. Well, I know we'll talk about kids in a little while, but it really, I think there's just a lot of unknown. And I think everyone is just trying to make some sense of normalcy for people in something that is completely unknown as to when this is going to end.
Yeah, I would again agree with everything Steve said. I mean, if we heard it once, we heard it over and over, that these refugees want to go home. And they really don't know what that means at this point, both from a timetable of when to a what am I going home to? We heard firsthand accounts of women and children leaving their husband/father back home. In particular, a family that Steve and I spent time with in one of the refugee hotels, a family of 4, and the teenage son was the spokesperson for the family, who spoke very good English and told the story of their journey. His name was Sasha, and he explained about the bombs and the shrapnel going off outside his house, and how they relocated to his grandmother's house, only to have to say goodbye to her after a few days. She was not able to make the trip, and she insisted that they leave. And so they left their home, her home, somewhere around February 27th is what they believed. And they wound up going through the Estonia Baltic countries to wind up in Poland. And I am not a geography guru by any stretch of the imagination, but I can only tell you that they didn't arrive where they arrived until March 19th, if that gives you some indication of the trek that they went through. The sounds that they described, and yet they thought they wanted to go home. Fast forward to the day the 2 days we were there, and they were making Aliyah to Israel the day we left. They made a decision that they were not going home. They were going to Israel, and hopefully to a calmer, more peaceful environment, and be able to rebuild their life. There's hundreds, thousands of those stories. And to know that Jaffe and the JDC are making that happen, that they're taking the time, that the thousands and thousands of volunteers that are there to speak to each person and find out where they want to go and then coordinate that. It's just heartwarming. We also had the opportunity to meet what is referred to as shlichim. I hope I pronounced that right, shlichim. They are Israeli young adults who take time away from Israel to visit various communities around the world to be part of their the local Jewish community in those places. And most of them are a year-long commitment or 2 years commitment. We met so many people that left their temporary communities to come to Poland and help with this crisis. And they speak multiple languages, and they can speak to the refugees about another way of life and help them make that transition to what comes next. And it's just, again, it's truly incredible.
So I was listening to colleagues of mine today sharing stories from some of them were with you. And what struck them was how the people they were meeting were people just like themselves. People who were doctors and lawyers and school teachers and librarians who had just gone and had their nails done a few weeks before and were busy planning parties and events and things. And in an instant, their normal life that they were so comfortable in evaporated. And I can only imagine what that must have felt for you to be with those people. And I'm so glad you were there to hug them. So on the screen, we see a bus and a picture of a warehouse. Can you tell us more about what was happening there?
Sure. So once people sort of took that little walk past all of those tents, there was transportation that brought them to, I would say this is sort of, I hate the term refugee, but it's sort of a giant refugee center. Essentially, if you went inside this place prior to the crisis beginning, it would look like, the first floor of a mall. Essentially, when you walked in, it looked like you were in a series of stores that went around in a giant circle, and there were stores on the inside, stores on the outside. And then the back end of it was just a massive warehouse that provided probably supplies for all of the stores. And there was a little food court in the corner. It has all been converted into housing and sort of resources for people who are staying there. And so essentially, when you walk in, each of the stores had anywhere between 40 and 60 cots on the floor, just lined with people. People were sleeping on them. They had their, whatever stuff they brought with them was underneath. And as you walked around, the food court was being staffed by the I think it's called the World Central Kitchen. And the World Central Kitchen provides food for anyone for free 24/7. So it was like a regular food court in a mall. People went up and were eating. And then in the back, in the warehouse area, in the front side of it was supplies that people could go pick up if they needed shampoo, if they wanted other supplies. And then on the inside, one of the first things you see, again, is an Israeli flag. And there is essentially a medical clinic staffed by Hadassah Hospital, which you see in this photo here. And there is the tall guy with the ski hat is an internist, and the woman to the left when you're looking at the photo is a pediatrician, both from Israel. And they are there all day doing wellness checks. Same thing as what was happening at the border, people coming in who don't have medications. They have supplies behind them. And they said some of the biggest issues are people who are on significant medications, patients who have multiple sclerosis, let's say, and they're getting monthly injections in the hospital in Kyiv, and now they don't have access to that anymore. And so it's not, just a little hypertension or maybe a cold, but they're dealing with people who have significant chronic medical conditions, trying to get them the appropriate care, trying to get the medications necessary, and doing it with, essentially a makeshift mini medical clinic from what would be a Radio Shack in a store, that size space. Really incredible. And when you leave this area, as you go around the corner, the JDC, along with sort of what would be, I guess, our BBYO, their version of the BBYO, have set up like almost a daycare facility. It's a big room that they set up with toys and games, and they have essentially counselors so that parents who are trying to figure out where they're going to go next can drop the kids off. And this way they have an opportunity to just be kids, to play, to color, to play games with counselors. And parents then have the opportunity to spend some time. And as you go around the corner of this sort of mall and or around the edge, the final pathway leading to the exit area, there are a line of computers set up on desks with flags above each one of the computers and a person staffing it. And again, from countries all over the world who are essentially there to assist with people getting travel visas so that they can leave, so that they don't stay there. And so Israel is there, and France was there, and Germany was there, and every country, and they work with the refugees to say, if you have some family, if you need to come, how do we get you in? And it's, so this was sort of, that building was a way station, I would say, for people who were trying to figure out where to go next. And again, volunteers were everywhere, staffed by hundreds of people, and they're all around, and everywhere you turn, there's a smile, someone trying to help out. Outside in the parking lot of that facility, we actually there were these 5 guys from Switzerland who literally got into a van because they wanted to help and drove, and they're just cooking. They're barbecuing outside. I mean, they just set up a little thing and they were cooking and giving meals to people when they came off the buses from the border. I mean, it's just really incredible.
So I was glad that you spoke about Hadassah, because one of the things I want folks to understand is that we talk about, the Jewish Federation system being a big tent. And while we primarily focus on our biggest overseas partners, Jaffe and JDC, the funds that we're raising now to help support this effort are going to many different organizations. And there are many partners on the ground serving people right now, being funded by our dollars, that include, beyond the Jewish Agency and the JDC, it includes World Ort, United Hatzalah, Hillel International, Nefesh B'Nefesh, the Israel Trauma Coalition, Hayas. We mentioned Hadassah. Chabad is a partner on the ground, and other smaller non-governmental organizations. So it's really quite a remarkable group of volunteer organizations that have been stitched together through the Federation system. So after the clearance process and the warehouse that you spoke about, what happens next?
So depending on sort of where people are headed and what their plans are, I probably couldn't speak to the exact details of how they get from point A to point B, but I can tell you that for many people, they get on a train and they end up going to Warsaw, which, when you get off the main train station in Warsaw, if you've been to Warsaw, the Marriott hotels across from the train station, right outside the train station, are 2 massive tents. So as people get off the train from, border areas, there are people there to greet them. And within those tents, you can get food, you can get information, you can get supplies. And again, I give amazing amount of credit to the Polish government for really stepping up and dealing with this humanitarian crisis in a way that we, it really it's really incredible. And so from there, depending on what people are planning on doing, I mean, obviously some people have significant resources and they may fly and go stay with family in various places. In Warsaw, there's multiple hotels that have been converted to sort of, again, refugee centers where people can go with temporary housing. So one hotel we went to was specifically set up by JDC and the agency and Jaffe in order to essentially prepare people for making Aliyah. And so when you get there, about this one hotel, about 80% of the rooms in the hotel were run by the JDC and Jaffe. And when you get there, again, they have information. The meeting rooms areas that we went to were set up, so that kids could go play and color, and they had dance classes, anything that they could do to make the kids' lives a little more normal, they had set up. And then in other rooms, it was almost like a small mall where people could go pick up supplies. They even had a room for pet supplies, but they had clothing, they had shoes, they had as you can see, all sorts of stuff for people. And then there was another meeting room that again was set up as a mini walk-in medical clinic, where again, staffed by physicians from Israel, who were there to, provide services, make sure everyone was staying healthy. They have clinical social workers and psychologists that are there to help these, families through the trauma of what they're experiencing. And I really, was impressed with the amount of effort they're going through to make sure that, everyone spends a little time coming through and getting checked out, making sure everyone has some time to talk to the social worker. It was really an impressive process. Again, run out of a room that, would be used for a small board meeting. And then the other hotel we went to was actually some Jewish, some not Jewish, just refugees who needed a place to stay because they're not sure what their plans are next. And again, in most of these areas, 80 to 90% of the hotel is taken up by this. And the volunteer organizations that are helping run these facilities set up, their sort of stuff on the main floor. In some cases, again, with information about how people could come to Israel if they wanted to, whether they were Jewish or not. And so again, what we were seeing was a lot of what the Jewish Agency was doing to bring Jews who wanted to make Aliyah, Jews who just wanted to come because they needed a place to go, as well as many non-Jews who just needed a place that they felt safe.
And I think it's important to point out that what Steve and I saw, while it was tremendous and overwhelming at the same time, was a snippet of what is going on all across the country in Poland and other countries. But in particular, because we were in Poland, when you think about 8 border crossings, we saw one, just one. And we saw where people go from that one, how they're disseminated throughout the country. I was truly taken aback by all the volunteers who quickly got to know and form some kind of bond, find a common ground to get to know these refugees, these families, speak their native language. And if they didn't, they found somebody very quickly who did, to, again, help ease with transition. And just watch the collaboration and the partnership for the family that came with nothing, that needed clothes. And when they told us we were going to go into they took hotel rooms. What you're looking at right now is in a hotel room. And there are signs on the door that tell you what size clothing you're going to find in that room. And the folded shirts and pants are on the bed that you or I would stay in as a guest. They've completely, every organization, every business has opened up their doors to do whatever they could. Going into the ballroom, the kids that Steve talked about were participating in music and dance, and they were so happy for us to walk in and watch them because it seemed normal to them. Life seemed normal. They were in a different place, but they were doing what they'd be doing if they were back in their hometowns. They were coloring, they were learning. There were computers, lots of what looked like elementary and middle school children with headphones on, learning on Zoom or other online portals for classes. Again, trying to normalize things so that the parent or parents could go attend to business of where do we go, what do we do. It's truly something that I think Steve said it earlier, when we have a crisis here in this country, a tornado, a devastating hurricane, it happens, and then you don't hear about it anymore, and life kind of just returns to a new normal. There's no end in sight for what's going on right now, and we are only scratching the surface of what's happened and what's to come. And we don't even know what we don't know yet. But there'll be, for sure, our ability to fulfill their needs will go on for a very long time.
Yes, and you went over to see those that are refugees that are outside of the country of Ukraine, and of them, there's probably about 4 million now that have left the country, but there's probably another 1.5 million or more that are internally displaced. And we have partners on the ground helping those that are internally displaced within the country. And in fact, folks may have noticed that Soroka Hospital, Israel set up their world-renowned, top-notch field hospital now in country inside Ukraine. So, and those, we're helping people of all stripes, Jews and non-Jews alike, governed by our values. And I think it's also important to keep in mind that, in a very large country like Ukraine, before the war, there were 200,000 Jews that we were aware of that qualified to be able, under the law of return, to make Aliyah to Israel. There were probably more than 200,000 Jews, but still that's about the number. And so we feel that it's our obligation to help everyone as best as we can. I'm starting to see a couple questions populating in the chat, and I think we're going to be moving. And yes, Steve, I'm going to go to you in 1 second. I know you want to say something.
Yeah.
But just as soon as Steve makes his next comment, after he's done, please put your questions in the chat, and then we'll do our best to answer as many of them as we are able to. Go ahead, Steve.
I just want to, there's one story that I've been blown away by, and it brings tears to my eyes just talking about. But in the group, in the hospital, in the hotel where we were meeting with people who were making Aliyah and going to Israel, we met this elderly gentleman. I'm going to guess he was in his mid-70s, who was there with his grandson, who has cerebral palsy. And they were in Ukraine, and so the older gentleman's mother had hid a Jewish family during the Holocaust. And she was awarded Yad Vashem's, Righteous of Nations Award. And when this broke out, they had stayed in touch. One of the offspring is still in Israel. Family of the offspring is still in Israel. And they had stayed in touch over the years, and they reached out to them. I've told this story without getting upset, but it gets me upset. And the people in Israel said, we'll do anything we can to bring you over here. And they called the JDC, and they went and picked them up, and they're bringing them over to Israel. It's such an amazing story that, one, this family is paying back something that they felt was so amazing that their family did for them. But two, that the JDC basically went into Israel in a van and went to their home, picked them up, and took them out of a war-torn, area to bring them back to the hotel, to get them on a plane and bring them safely to Israel. And I just think that's just a heartwarming story, and really moved us to tears at the time when we saw it. And the one thing the man brought out with him was the certificate from Yad Vashem and the medal that his mother was awarded. Truly just an incredible story.
That was a very tough session that we had. The gentleman that Steve referenced, and the story that they shared came on the heels of the story that I shared earlier about the family of four. They were sitting side by side, sharing with us their stories. And I just think that, and his was the last one. And I think hearing what they were doing, what his grandmother did, just really drove it all home. There wasn't a dry eye in the room. And it just spoke to exactly what we are trying to do across the world, humanitarian, people to people, be there to lend a helping hand, stand up. And as the Hebrew word says, hineni, here I am, stand up and do, roll your sleeves up and do something. And that was truly a story that summed it all up for us.
So we're going to shift now into to taking some questions and answers. And and please put your questions in the chat. I do want to respond to one about the volunteers and the language barrier. And certainly, Steve and Amy, please, talk about the volunteers that you met and what they're doing. I do want to just make a pitch, though, which is that right now there is a need for volunteers, especially people who are healthcare workers, social workers, and childcare workers. However, we're looking for people who are Russian speakers. So if you are a Russian speaker and would like to volunteer you need to go for a couple of weeks at a time, at least a week. Or if you know of someone, to please put them in touch with us at the Jewish Federation. We are very honored that Rabbi Michael Farbman is about to leave for the region to spend Passover, to bring comfort, to bring pastoral services as someone who was born in the region and is a native Russian speaker. But we're certainly looking for all people to help. So with that, about the volunteers, did you encounter folks? What kinds of things were they doing? Who were they? How did they communicate?
Yeah, I mean, I think in general, most of the people who came over from JDC and Jaffe, I think the primary sort of leaders of each of the areas were people who spoke Russian, Ukrainian, Polish. I mean, one or all of those three. And they definitely, as I said, there was a young woman who's probably 22 years old who, her parents immigrated from Ukraine when she was 10 or 8 or some early young age, but speaks Ukrainian fluently. And so she came over and she is volunteering for Jaffe and JDC in Poland to help translate. We never felt, there was always someone around. And so no matter who we spoke to or where we were, there was always someone who was there to translate. And many of these people spoke English as well. So the language part didn't feel like a burden when we were there. And granted, we were in a limited interaction with people. And so, and there was someone who could be with us and do that. I don't know how much of an issue it is on a day-to-day basis, but I do know that, there's always a need for people who speak the languages. But there were clearly plenty of volunteers who were able to communicate on our behalf and communicate among people.
Thank you. So I'm just sort of reviewing the questions in the chat, and we already have volunteers who want to go. So if we weren't already crying, I'm now crying myself. Thank you very much, people, for stepping up so kindly. There's a question in the chat about the organizations that are there helping now, and if we know if they're prepared to be there for the long haul. I'm wondering what you may have heard while you were there.
I don't know that we heard anyone say anything specifically about that, but the conversations were constantly about the fact that this is a long-term need, which again gets me back to this idea. I know that everyone is raising money for Ukraine right now, and this is something that there's an immediate crisis. But I think it goes to the greater, issue that, we raise money every year that goes to support these organizations, JDC, Jaffe, tons of other organizations that are on the ground. And I think that we all recognize, and the conversations were constant, that the long-term implications of what is going on there are going to be housing crisis for a decade, maybe longer. There will be displaced people who have nowhere to go. There will be a need to resettle people in different areas. There will be needs for mental health benefits, watching your country in war and as a child being displaced and then having to, live in a hotel or live in a refugee center. These are going to have long-standing repercussions for them and are going to require a lot of support for a really long time. Every organization that we met with was essentially aware of all this. We spoke about all this. And so I don't think there's anyone that thinks that this is a get in, fix, get out, that this is a get in, establish relationships, develop those relationships, build upon those relationships, and foster ongoing relationships.
Thank you. So I'm going to ask you both for closing comments, and I think we'll start with Amy.
Again, I want to thank Steve and Judy and the Federation for making this opportunity for me to go and do my small part and play any role in representing us over there and bearing witness firsthand to what's happening. I want to reiterate what I alluded to at the beginning and most definitely talked about in an interview, which is, we're only able to do now what we're doing now because of what we do 365 days a year. This didn't just like poof, all of a sudden we're on the ground and we're helping people. This is planning that goes on all year long by our partner agencies and by JFNA, planning for it in any given country at any given time, because it's what we do. We go in and we help, and we do this because we as a Jewish people have been subjected to such horrible atrocities in our history, and swore never again, that we will never let it happen again. And the world didn't listen yet then, but they're listening now and they're acting. And we as Jewish Federation of Greater New Haven and Jewish Federation of North America can only pivot the way we do and plan for that parachute moment, right? It looks like a parachute moment where all of a sudden this stuff just popped up on the border. But it was years in the making, plans and the ability to call back all the professional staffs of these organizations and put them into other roles that they're not accustomed to playing. So one of the women that spent a lot of time with us, who I feel like I have a new best friend, Jenny from Jaffe, her role is the director of the community-wide shlichim program, these teens and young adults that come to our communities. But here she was, running the operation of helping the refugees make Aliyah to Israel. And it's just cross-training and all this back work that goes on in preparation for a crisis like this. So, I guess my final word is, even though I've been doing what I do for 6 years, I have a whole new understanding of the importance of our unrestricted annual campaign, so that we can respond at any given moment, at any given time, in any given place.
Steve?
You stole my lines.
I wanted to go first.
Yeah, that's why you went first. No, I would say, first, I'm glad that we were able to go and to represent our community and make people know that we care. And I'm thrilled at the outpouring of support that this community has shown in both financial contributions to the Ukrainian relief funds, as well as dropping off supplies. At some point we had to shut things off because people kept dropping off more and more and more stuff. And I wish we could have brought all of it. It was hard enough dragging 350 pounds between two of us through the airport. But for me, again, as I started off by saying, when I went to Ukraine the first time in 2018, it opened my eyes to all of the things that we do around the world on behalf of Federation and what our contributions do to support Jews and non-Jews around the world who are in need. And as much as I'm thrilled when we do these supportive programs for Ukraine relief and people donate tons of money, and JFNA has gotten over 40 million deployed already, and that's wonderful. But really, like as Amy said, what is truly amazing is that we have the ability as our community of organizations around the world to drop in at the time of crisis. And that is only because of what we raise annually for campaign. And the money that we give every year to campaign helps support these organizations and the infrastructure that's needed. So when these crises come up, we're there. And so it really, for me, it solidified in my mind the importance of the annual campaign, not just to support our local agencies and our local community, but really to support, people around the world. And again, it's not just Jews around the world. JDC and Jaffe were on the ground, and they are helping every single person who crosses across that border, directs them in the right direction, tells them where to go, offers support. It is really wonderful to see that those efforts, and again, I'm happy that I had the opportunity to see it. I'm happy that I had the opportunity to share it all with you, and I hope this ends quickly and we don't. This doesn't go on forever. My prayers are for all of the Ukrainian displaced individuals, that they get home soon and get home safely, and that we can wrap things up sooner rather than later.
So I'll say amen to that. And I just want to add one more piece about refugees. So, we talk about the Jewish Federation. There's so much that we do every single day. And one of the things we do is work in the area of advocacy. And our system and our federation and our Jewish Community Relations Council, our JCRC, has been active to lobby to push the United States government to open the doors to Ukrainian refugees. And we're hopeful that we will be receiving refugees in New Haven. We have a very large Russian-speaking population that we proudly resettled in the 1990s, that we still work with through the Federation to this day, with a special coordinator who's a social worker who works with them. And we're hopeful that we're going to be able to welcome people to our community now. And so our Federation and Jewish Family Service and JCAR, the Jewish Coalition for Refugee Resettlement, which is a partnership of the Federation and 6 synagogues, are making preparations now to welcome them to our community. Hopefully we'll have some. But what we know that we're helping, all of us, with new Olim, new Israeli citizens, those that want to make Aliyah to Israel. I think we already have 12,000 that have already made the journey. We expect thousands more. And in addition to following them in their journey and becoming part of Israeli society, I'm hopeful that a year from now, when our community travels to Israel on a very special trip with our friends and neighbors in Hartford, that we'll have an opportunity to meet with them and hear all that's unfolded in their lives over this past year, the journey that they've made and the new lives that they're creating in the state of Israel. So I want to encourage you all to join us there. And if you want to learn more about that, tomorrow night, you can join us at a very special information session where you can learn more about the trip. And with that, I want to encourage you all. I'm sure you see the QR code. You can find more information about Ukraine on our website, jewishnewhaven.org. We're constantly updating that page with lots of information as we learn it. Already the system has raised well over $40 million on our way to $150 million, and we won't stop until we're able to help everybody. Thank you all so much. Aziz and Pesach to you all. Happy Passover. Good night.